In this special Mom Meets Machine series, we are joined by Dr. Elise Silva, the Director of Policy Research at Pitt Cyber. Her work focuses on technology policy and the impact of emerging technologies on society. After testing Elise's conversation guide, What I Want My Kids to Know About Gen AI, with our own kids and our friends' kids, we were surprised by the thoughtful, engaging discussions that it sparked. In this series, we'll explore topics like AI hallucinations, bias, and misinformation, while sharing practical ways parents can help their kids think critically about the AI tools they encounter every day. Together, we'll examine not just how AI works, but how we can raise curious, resilient kids, and what these conversations can teach us about being human.
Very rude. What did you just generate? That's so weird.
What's happening?
What'd you do?
Let's see.
I generated an image of a pretty person. See?
A pretty person.
A pretty person.
Oh my gosh, can we show? Come here.
Yeah.
I need to see this.
That looks like Dolly Parton.
It does. I gotta
It looks
show
like
this.
Tina Turner, Dolly Parton.
What is happening? What is
so
happening
weird.
here?
Timu Dolly.
What was the prompt?
It is Timu Dolly Parton.
Generate me an image of a pretty person.
That's
Pretty
all you
person.
said?
Are
Not
you
a
sure
pretty
you didn't say
person?
preppy? I said pretty.
Oh my gosh.
Wow, that
So
was really
weird.
something, Zia.
I'm gonna ask again.
Try a new chat and ask again. I'm curious.
Me an image of a
Elise, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. My husband just left to go to Spain, and I have a full week with the kids on my own. And then on the day before Mother's Day, I'm going to be taking them solo to Italy. So there's like light at the end of the tunnel, but it is
So
like
wild.
it is wild. Okay. We have like the questions that we sent. So the three kind of main topics are the biased representation of success, hallucinations, and sycophancy. And then there's like 5 questions that we can kind of go off of to talk more about like the guide. And maybe before we get started, it'd be lovely to kind of like hear about where the guide is right now, the discussion guide, what you're thinking about it, what the intent is really. And also an introduction of you. Can we hear a little bit about your background? That'd be great.
Yeah, so I'm Elise Silva. I'm the Director of Policy Research at Pitt's Institute for Cyber Law Policy and Security, called Pitt Cyber. And we do a lot of interesting work in the community around cybersecurity, education, workforce development, and I've been really interested in AI governance and community AI literacy and community engagement. But this guide was more of a labor of love, and I'm starting to call it, because of my conversations with you, Kendra, more of a conversation guide than anything else. And what I really think it does is fill a gap that a lot of parents have. Like, how do we even talk about AI with our kids? What does that look like? And as it turns out, it's very difficult to do because, as we've all noticed, it's an emergent technology. It's changing very quickly. The ways that it's showing up in our lives and in our children's lives is also changing very quickly. And so what I decided to do was create kind of these conversation starters that are tensions, a lot of them. Some of them are statements that are kind of obvious and hard to argue, but a lot of them I think that there's nuance in, and that was by design, so that you could, like, here's a statement about AI. Let's talk about what that looks like for you, child. And right now the guide is out under the Pitt Cyber's publication page, so you can access it freely there. I would love to have more conversations with parents as they experiment with it, even if things don't go well. I've updated the guide with some of the feedback given your experiences that I feel really happy with, actually. So I'm really glad that we were able to do some of that experimentation.
That's awesome. Real quick, and then I'll hand it over to Leah to kind of get this started. But do you want to talk about what we noticed? And because I think like our discussion about it being a snapshot of all of these issues with Gen AI technologies and how it can be used is like has really changed my perspective on how to talk about this as like someone that does science communication and how I think about it. it feels so, there's no foundation. It's always changing. It's like quicksand. So I'm curious, like for you creating this guide, how has this kind of reshaped your thinking about AI?
Yeah. So when I was creating it, I had several people read through, parents of, kids of different ages. And I had one person that gave great feedback, which was, I'd love to have activity ideas for this. And I was like, that is great feedback. And so I kind of went through and I brainstormed a few activities. And 3 months later, those activities didn't work all that well because the models had changed significantly enough that it was very hard to replicate things like hallucinations or super obvious bias that would be just like plainly evident. Whereas, 6 months ago, you could pretty much replicate some of those things fairly easily. And what that taught me, and I think should teach all of us as parents, is that there are going to be these issues that persist, but they will not be obvious and they will be very difficult to replicate, but that does not mean that they don't exist. Which to me just shows the importance of talking about it even more. So going back to this as a conversation guide, like having the conversations early and often so that these things are in our kids' heads while they interact with the tools, at least will give them a roadmap to maybe pick up on patterns that they start to see, even if like a very obvious biased representation isn't super easy to replicate in the moment.
I think that's such a good point, Elise, that it makes it more scary, right? It's almost like subversive that these biases exist. And before, when they were so obvious, it's making me think of like systemic racism versus kind of 50s style racism, right? And so we know that these things exist, but we can say that they don't now. That is really fascinating. So I think in that vein, Kendra, we at a place where I'm asking these specific questions, kind of guiding this towards what we want to be talking to Elise about. And we had such a blast going through your guide. It was fun to do with our kids. They liked it. They were really engaged, as you heard. And so thank you for that experience. And it really did help us now to continue those conversations at home because we had that initial experience. And so it just kind of made it so we have this language that we could use together that has been really fun. So thank you. I think the first thing that we wanted to talk about is specifically, so we talked about the different tendencies that we wanted to reproduce or we wanted to discuss with our kids. The first being the biased representation of success was the first exercise that we did and that we had conversations with our kids about. And so I think what we wanted to do was just have you define that as a risk clearly, and why is that important, and why is it a conversation we want to have with our kids?
Yeah, this conversation guide is very much written for people who are not technologists. So it gives you a shared vocabulary to work with, but all of those terms I think are defined in really accessible ways. I cared a lot that people could just like pick this up and understand it, that it wouldn't be something that had like a really difficult entry point because, parents don't have time for that. But that doesn't mean that they can't learn about these things and that you can't talk about them meaningfully. I think about it like driving a car. You can get in a car and put your seatbelt on and follow the rules of the road, even without knowing how a combustion engine works. And so I did want to make that point early on, that this is for people who are not necessarily technologists, but I also think people with a technical background would find it meaningful. So that particular exercise where we were trying to replicate a version of success, right, that model would spit out that might show pretty obvious bias, came from a statement, which is that AI isn't good or bad, but that doesn't mean it's neutral. And the idea there is that all technologies are created in human contexts and then used in human contexts. And AI is no different. And so AI was created with human data. And that human data was collected from imperfect humans and collected imperfectly and organized imperfectly and had a lot of biases in it. So if an image generator has access to all of the images online that it can get for free, there are some people that are going to be more represented in those images than others. That's just the case. That's how data works. And that is 100% the case in image generators. So there's a really famous example a couple years ago from Brookings, a research institute, that just typed in, you know, make me an image of a successful person. And it made like 20 images of a white guy that looked pretty rich. And he was young and very conventionally attractive. He was standing, so clearly not disabled, right? Like, there were a lot of things about this that were pretty obvious, like conventional markers of success. But what we all want to do with our kids is have the critical conversations about, well, what happens if that's the only version of success that you see around you? And that's like a wider conversation, but a really interesting one to have with technology that you're interacting with and that is like maybe impacting the way that you see the world around you. So it's getting harder and harder to replicate those types of obvious biases. When you type in something like, make me an image of a doctor now, you might not see such obvious biases. But if you do it a whole bunch of times, you might see it, you know, in a pattern of some kind. The other thing that I kind of wanted to say about that was that you can have, I think, really complicated conversations with very young people about this just by asking, like, what does success mean to you? Like what do you think about success, and why do you think that, and why do you think that this is what's showing up here, whether you're trying to do it with an image generator yourself or you're looking at some of these historic images, you know, or moments in time or snapshots that LLMs have produced in the past. As it turns out, these companies can kind of hard code some things now, so they can say, hey, if somebody asks for a doctor, make sure that you're trying to show some diversity in that. But that doesn't mean that they're able to do it for all sorts of things. So I listened to your recording and I really loved the one where they typed in, show me an image of a pretty person. And I loved that. And it showed like a very conventional, like fancy lady, right? It was so funny, right? It was like Dolly Parton meets Tina Turner or something like incredible. I loved that because it would give you an opportunity to be like, why would you want a machine to tell you what a pretty person looks like, you know, and what do you think a pretty person is and what makes somebody beautiful? So I think that these are wider conversations and that the technology is just an entry point into them.
Can I ask that? So I love that point. I think you're right. And these are questions that maybe we would talk to kids about because you would see an illustration in a book, right? And so why does Rapunzel look like this? Why does Moana look like this? And having those, are they both beautiful in different ways? And I think there's some really important conversations to be had there. I'm asking you because I have you as more of a technology oriented person. Why can LLM do it once, but not 100 times? If it knows, okay, make sure we're showing diversity when asked for a doctor on the first try, why doesn't it know it after the 100th try?
Yeah, so like they're getting better at remembering context for sure, but they lose that context after a time. And so really it's just interacting with your prompt over and over and over and regenerating with some context in mind, but not the whole context in mind. So this is a conversation we're going to talk about hallucinations, I think, as well. But this is like a context where you can get an LLM to act good, or it will like act good for like a couple chats, and then like later on will start acting bad. So
Andrew's always telling me, but why?
One other thing I wanted to ask is, like, to me, this, in terms of a metaphor, it feels like a Band-Aid. You know what I mean? Like, it feels like the hard coding is a Band-Aid over a wound. And I don't know if you want to think about like these risks or tendencies as wounds, where like, I'm curious, Elise, if you think that the Band-Aid's actually like a bad idea, and that so it's like, I don't know, when I start, I don't know, maybe it's because I'm a biologist, I start thinking about like abscesses and, you know, like you're not really treating the main issue. And so for biased representations of success, do you think that's what the risk is and not really understanding the problem?
yeah, that's such a good way of thinking about it. And that's an accessible, I think, metaphor, and that it's like, oh, we have this very powerful technology that can recreate some pretty problematic biases. So after the fact, we're going to retrofit a fix. But that doesn't change the technology itself. It doesn't change the training data. It doesn't change how it fundamentally functions in any way. It's just like a little prompt at the very end that's like, can you not do this anymore? And so the technology is still the same. The training data is still the same. It's like a very small human intervention that can band-aid some of the issue, but it's not healing it. You know, it's not stitching it up in any way that is going to change anything. And it's created that way. And I think that this is part of the answer to the other question, right? Is that the technology is fundamentally created to give you different answers every time. It is not deterministic. There isn't a right or wrong, right? It's a probabilistic system. And whenever you're dealing with probabilities, it's going to give you the average. And it's always going to kind of come back to that average because it's just giving you what it predicts is the next likely thing. And if it's been trained on a whole bunch of images that look like this, even if there's a little prompt that tells it to do this other thing, eventually it's going to come back to that average when you do it the 100th time. You know, it'll make its way back to the average.
And I think that that's difficult because for me, with conversations that I'd have with my kids, I can speak about this from a psychological perspective, or I can talk about what we can do as far as day by day to make sure that we're assessing the value of the different images that are being populated or assessing what we think about them. But there's little that we can do about the physical code that exists, right, in this moment. So and I wonder, I don't understand any of this. So wondering if is it prohibitively difficult? It's not like you can scrap the whole thing and come back and say like, well, we got to train it off different data because this is not working in this moment.
Yeah, that's a question for not me.
Yeah, right?
That's a question for these labs, the frontier labs,
Right.
is, you know, what are you willing to do and how are you willing to build these models? And what large data sets do we realistically have access to? And the internet tends to be the data set that we have realistic access to. And there are a lot of arguments about this, about like different ways of training systems with different kinds of data. And they are like fairly technical types of questions, but some of them are moral and some of them are value-based as well. I think we really wrongly assume that computational tools are objective. I think that that's a conversation you can have with kids. Assume that it's a computer, so it's not going to have a way of seeing one way or another. But you have to be like, it really actually depends how humans make that computer. And humans have made it this particular way with these particular limitations.
In this episode, we talked about how the bots got so smart or dumb and how that's